Thank you, John. Comrades, I'm honoured to be with you to celebrate this amazing struggle that we remember in many different ways. John's determined to demote me often on his posters as I'm the former leader of the GFTU, but pleased to report I'm still there as the General Secretary, and it's still a vibrant organisation. Have a look at our website. It's still cutting edge after 120 years of low profile but solid work for the working class. We're still there doing great stuff. I was on the south coast where I lived with my mother and grandmother who brought me up in a rented, damp, cold, horrible house in 1972, and we relied on the coal bunker, and the coal bunker during that year got remarkably empty. But there was not one word in our community at that time against the NUM and the miners. All the hatred of the working class was focused on the cause of the problem, which of course was the Heath government on behalf of the ruling class at that time. I want to just say a few reflective, broad sweep things about the history of our nation since that time, and then maybe, as John's indicated, just have a little pointer at some things that I think are important for us in the way ahead. The period 68 to 72 will need a lot of unpacking by the historians one day. 68 was the year when we finally achieved universal franchise for all those over the age of 18. And whatever different political perspectives we've come from, I think it's important to reflect again on that whole history, many of us still know it, of the struggles of the Chartists, the early trade unions, the suffragettes and others to get the vote. And whatever we think of that and its effect, after all those sacrifices and the deaths that occurred and the imprisonments and all the rest of it, and the torture of the suffragettes, we eventually got it in 68. That's when the voice of the people in the system in which we live was first, as it were, legalised, made strong, made loud. And I think that put the wind up the ruling class, big style. And one of the things they started to do at that time through Heath was to plot and plan for the federal superstate of the European Union. All the history books now in the National Archives, all the papers that have been secret for many years reveal that they knew at that time that it was not about the creation of a so-called common market where you go and buy your eggs or your vegetables and all the rest of it. It was an attempt to undermine the voice, to silence the voice of the people by taking power away from the British Parliament and giving it to the unelected commissioners and all the rest of them in the EU, who wanted to take over political and economic control over previously independent nations. The European Union began as the European Coal and Steel Community, an organisation designed to take away coal and steel production from independent nations. So it would be about removing the material basis of political national independence from countries. So those two things, as in my interpretation of history, the silencing of the people's vote and the power of that and the implications that it had, and the removal of coal and steel were of course the endeavours of Heath and his government at that time to break independence and to give us a bigger political problem than any nation had probably faced in the world before. The first industrialised workshop of the world facing an enemy that wanted to pull it apart. So in 76 we voted to go into the common market, stay there or whatever it was. And then the first great significant political act against us and against our country following the joining, October 79. We should never forget it. There's been lots of talk in the recent 3 years of debates on what's happened about the migration and the free movement of labour. But that's secondary to what happened in 79 when Thatcher removed the exchange controls on capital. She allowed the wealth of the nation to be frittered away on the speculative markets of the financiers. All the wealth that we produced here prior to that time was subject to rules and regulations, even the amount of money you could take away on holiday with you. You couldn't take capital and wealth out of the country because our movement had been part of saying it needs to be restrained, restricted and dedicated to wealth and growth here. So never forget that date, a significant one. Shortly followed, of course, by a major attack on steel. I could never believe it in the late 70s when you'd read of 60,000 steel jobs to go. But by 1980 we got to the severity of the beginning of the end of the steel industry. And then 4 years after that, a planned, deliberate, systematic attack to end our coal industry. It's not that difficult to destroy a country and a nation if you want to. Let capital fly abroad, remove steel production, and with it then engineering and all the manufacturing base, and then remove your source of an independent energy supply in coal. And then follow that on with new labour to complete the job, to bring in complete control over our public services through privatisation and all the rest of it. And the movement turned away from the nation and thought that the saviour was in Brussels. All the attention of the movement was turned to those we didn't elect in the European Court of Justice, the EU commissioners, to pretend that they could stem the attacks on us and liberate us from the new globalised neoliberal economy. They were the very causes of it. And that subservience to those that we didn't elect, you could say, was the sum total of the cultural and political effect of taking away the power of the vote that had been established in '68. So we faced the slowest, longest, slow-motion coup d'etat in history, of those not elected by the people taking us over. And that made many on our side forget two of the things that hold us together as a movement: our internationalism and our nationalism. We can only be socialists if we combine the two. A hand of friendship that we've extended as a movement throughout the world to workers in struggle when they've needed it was paradoxically reduced, taken away, diminished when we thought that the EU would save us all. And similarly, the root of socialism in national democracy was taken away. But now, like many generations of those before us, and the image I like is the one of the sleeping giant, which recurs in ancient history and in medieval history and in many cultures all over the world. The sleeping giant of the people eventually managing to wake up. And we've done that. Not in the way we might have expected, but we've done it. We've got out of the trap. We've got out of the undemocratic neoliberal control of the EU. Yes, it was the Tories who were clearest on that, and in many parts of our own history they've been brilliant at sussing out the mood of the people and the thing that needs to be done. They did it again, more clearly than our side did. But now they've done it. And the legitimacy of Johnson's government has gone. That was the only reason why they were elected, to get us out. We're out. We've now got to get them out. But of course we face very significant problems in doing that. The first one is one of the most anti-democratic bits of legislation that's been brought in against us. That was in 2011, the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which was brought in at the time to try and prop up the Liberals for eternity in coalition with the Tories. But it's a pernicious, undemocratic act that says the only way you can get rid of a government is if they decide to go, if there's a 2/3 majority in Parliament against them, or their time of 5 years comes up, and you can only get rid of MPs if they commit a heinous crime. So that sticks them there. Now, both of the parties, Labour and Tories, said they'd repeal the Act before the election. I doubt that either of them want to do that now. They want their 5-year stretch. And the other difficulty we face, and many times in history we've faced it before, when the Labour Party gets an absolute thumping in the election, they want to spend 5 years to recover. And we might not have that long. And then there's the other one that's raised its head again, what I call the separatism. Those who believe that by having a hard border across the top of England and rejoining perhaps the European single currency and trying to rejoin the EU would be a good thing. I've always believed, and particularly coming from Coventry in this region, where so many of our manufacturing-based shop stewards committees were genuinely national, England, Wales, Scotland, that our class has been the class that has forged the unity of the nation of Britain, which should not be split apart into Wales, Scotland and England. So it's a time for some progressive patriotism and generous internationalism and confident optimism that we, our class, has just dealt the biggest blow to world globalisation that we've seen in our generation. And of course, this all presents a challenge to trade unionists in particular to take up where we left off perhaps in '76, when nearly 60% of workers were in unions and 80% of workers were covered by national collective bargaining agreements negotiated by the unions. It's now less than 20% density membership of trade unions and less than 20% density of workers covered by collective bargaining. So we're going to have to shake off 2 generations of learning to be subservient to others who didn't elect, and believing that all that could be done was to rely on the hidden hand of the market and the illusory magic wand of the unelected EU commissioners. Now, in that rebuilding, that reawakening of the giant again, the challenge will be not to give any power away, to recognise the truth that real power begins in the workplace and with our workmates, and that sense of solidarity and democratic decision-making that enables us to progress our cause. But in the process, there are 2 or 3 things that certainly at the GFTU we're working on that we think are going to be helpful for that reawakening. First, a rebirth of political trade union education. Back in the day, trade unionists would be amongst the smartest and cleverest people you'd ever met because our courses were based on politics, philosophy, economics and history. That was all changed, and we've written about the changes. People went on to kind of vocational, technical trade union education, where you were taught paragraph 7 of the Redundancy Act or paragraph 9 of the Health and Safety Act, but you weren't taught to understand why they were making you redundant in the first place, or why the structures of power meant that your workplace was unhealthy. So there's a need for a repoliticisation of education. And critical to that is re-engaging, as this gathering already done this evening with our history. If people ask me what is the worst thing that has happened to us over the last 20 or 30 years under neoliberal control, I say it's the disconnect they've created between us and our history. I saw the 1974 Blue Peter Annual the other day. That had 4 pages on the history of the Tolpuddle martyrs. Schools used to teach the history of the trade union movement. They don't anymore. There were dozens and dozens of labour history courses at university. Hardly any left. Trade unions used to make their new reps study the history of our movement, to enthuse and inspire people with what we created and the fact that we, the working class, are the nation, and all the good democratic things that exist here are because of our class and its history. Now that's gone. So we're doing lots of things about it. One thing I will plug is an illustrated history of the British people that we've just done. It's ideal for adults, ideal for younger people. It's in an illustrated format, and it tells the story of that red line of continuous social history in Britain. So lots for us to do in this critical junction, to take heart, take heed, and take confidence, not just from the struggles that so many of our brothers and sisters have fought in the past, but the real struggle that we have won today to start to free our country and ensure that as a free nation we can make it work for all of the workers. Solidarity.